Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Press A to Climb Soapbox, our little video game kind of podcasting, slightly news-ish, but podcasting sort of podcast, blog, vlog, whatever the hell you want to call it.
It's topical discussion.
Yeah, topical discussion about video gaming. Sometimes
Not
it's
to be
topical.
taken internally. It's topical only.
The discussions are brought up by a topic that may be topical, but not necessarily topical in and of itself. Anyways, now that we got all neckbeardy about the word topical, I am your host, Nasty Man, and the other man being all neckbeardy with me is joined by Benjamin Arthur.
Hey, everybody.
Tymo.
How you doing?
And ScaryUncleDevin.
Hello.
And this episode, we're going to be talking about storytelling in video games. And what we mean by that is when it comes to story in almost anything, in books, TVs, movies, video games, you can kind of break it into two segments. There's the actual story, the lore and the events of the story, and then there's storytelling, how the story is told, the way scenes are framed, the way dialogue plays out, the way the game or movie is written. So as it comes to specific stories, we're not really going to discuss that much today. We might have some comments about any games that come up during a discussion. But what we're really going to focus on is storytelling. And really, what is good storytelling in a video game? Because video games function differently, obviously, from like movies and television and those things. Is the game is interactive, so storytelling in games can let you be interactive with the story, like them old choose your own adventure books. Actually, a lot of what could be described as the first computer games or video games were probably, by today's standards, wouldn't even be considered games. There were those old text adventures that were pretty much just like choose your own adventure books, but they were on the Apple II. It wasn't until they started actually being able to do things like introduce, 6-bit, 8-bit graphics that games kind of turned into games. A lot of that early stuff is just those old text adventures. It's just scrolls of texts. You pick a decision, which is, marginally more interactive than going down to the local library and getting your choosing your own adventure book and be like, if you want to do this, turn to page 62.
There's less page turning, really. It's the lazy man choose your own adventure.
It's the thumb saving choose your own adventure.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about those cuts. Yeah. I was just gonna say that. You don't have to worry about those paper cuts.
What if you've used your keyboard so much like the keys are sharp?
I would question what you're doing with your keyboard.
Yeah, I have questions about,
did you break like
the
every key
way you use a keyboard?
and then regrind them out of metal?
Missing keys?
What are you replacing your keys with? Are you like getting a sheet metal down at the local construction supply shop and grinding these keys out? They got sharp edges.
What guitar players with calluses on their fingers. Devin has calluses on the tips of all of his fingers from just pounding away from the keyboard, from
just like slamming down on the keyboard.
I went down
Takes
to
out
Hot
all of his
Topic,
anger.
and I bought one of those stupid studded belts, and I just ripped it apart, and I've been replacing the keys with those.
Oh my god! Yeah, but one of
It's
those
for training
one of those
purposes.
shitty ass Hot Topic studded belts back from your high school days.
Dude, they went with my black camo baggy pants.
I know, man. They so did. If only it were 1998 again.
Some of my old black cargo pants recently. I was like, wow, why did I ever? Terrible decision.
Oh yeah, no, I remember. And we won't get into that.
Yeah,
anyway,
moving on.
Moving on.
For now.
I agree.
Devin's pants are not the
We're
issue
not
here.
We're not having a conversation about Devin's pants.
So moving on. So what brought this up for me is that, it's the beginning of the new year, and at the end of a year / beginning of a year, everybody who's in any sort of gaming news journalism sort of outlet always releases their game of the year stuff, which we're not going to do. Sorry to disappoint J.J. Abrams and Gabe Newell, or it was J.J. and Gabe, right? They were our two viewers?
I thought
or did we lose them?
We
We assumed it was them.
No, we had
I was trying
JJ
to-
and somebody
yeah,
else
it
for
was
a
JJ
while.
and
It was
somebody
another,
else.
It was another director.
I
Was
wanna
it
say-
Michael Bay or
No,
somebody.
I want to say it was Gabe
it was
because we
another
were
film
talking
director.
about
He came in with
JJ
the Steam
doing
box.
some sort of.
We'll have to go back and hit the archives
Yeah.
and find out.
See, even we
But
don't
we're
watch
not-
our own videos.
Yeah. Oh,
Either
hell
way,
no.
we
No, I
appreciate,
do.
We
It's
appreciate
just-
the
These are going
whoever's
online.
left.
Yeah, whoever's left, but we are not gonna do a games.
If it's
our
not Gabe or
games of
JJ,
the
we
year.
apologize. We'll remember who you are and issue an apology or something.
An official apology. But what brought this up is, when game of the year list comes out, people talk about what they liked about different games and what got them onto their games of the year lists. And there's always the games that come out that they contribute story. Like, oh, this game had a really great story. Like it had good gameplay that they might have enjoyed as well. But they're like, oh, this game had a really good story that I enjoyed. And, needless to say, a game that was on a lot of people's lists and was listed as having a really good story, I felt needed a little clarification. And this is kind of what brought it up. Me and my roommate were talking about this the other day. And that game is BioShock Infinite.
Could have guessed.
Yeah, I think Kyle might have been able to guess that pretty heartedly. Now, again, we're not going to talk about the story specifically. My qualms with that, but really what it came down to was I look at it and I look at BioShock Infinite and the way that the story is told, the actual storytelling. The writing I thought was good. It was well written. But I feel that the story gains nothing from being a video game story. I don't see any way that the gameplay really makes the story good or makes the story better. It doesn't have for a good example. If you compare it to the first BioShock.
Okay, I was actually specifically going to ask if that's
Now,
if that was more.
I'm going to spoil
appreciate.
the midway reveal of BioShock for anybody who hasn't played it.
Okay, if you haven't
So
played it yet,
turn
hit
away.
pause.
We're past the
Find it
spoiler
somewhere
moratorium, I
and-
think.
Yeah,
Just
spoiler
play it.
moratorium is
Yeah.
over on that game, but if you're interested, it's coming up. There's
Would you kindly tell us?
there's the midway break where you actually get to Andrew Ryan and the whole "would you kindly," and he reveals that, oh, this phrase is hard coded into your brain to make you do whatever the hell somebody wants, and that's a story reveal that's pretty good. But it has this super extra impact when you realize that you've just kind of been drudging through this game, going place to place to place because the game's been telling you to go place to place to place.
Yeah, it's a commentary.
Yeah, it's a it was a commentary on what's happening. And another one that is very similar was Spec Ops: The Line. I know Kyle played that. I don't think either of you guys did. But that's another one of those games where I
had forgotten about that.
Yeah, the points it tries to prove with its story are super impactful because of the fact that you're playing a game, where it's like if you were watching a movie and it was just this character on screen was doing these actions, and then later it comes to the point of the story and the horrors of war and stuff like that, it's not as impactful. But when you realize, oh God, I've been doing these things for this whole time, that has a whole new level of impact on you as a person. And it's one of those things where it makes it being a story of a video game really good. And Spec Ops also had one thing that I like, which is multiple endings, which is something, again, to go back to the BioShocks, BioShock had, BioShock Infinite did not. That is something a lot of people don't know, is there are multiple endings to the original BioShock.
You say
They're
multiple,
not very
but-
different. They're not very different, but there are, I believe, there are at least two. Are there actually three? I couldn't remember if there was three.
There's good, bad, and really bad.
There's one that's
right. There's one
save
if
them
you
all,
save them
kill them
all.
all, and then there's one that's kind of gray.
Neutral, yeah. So, that being said, I want to hear from you guys kind of, like, because video games are starting to become into their, they're past their infantile years, and we're kind of getting to that stage where video gaming as kind of a culture is getting out of almost its adolescence. So it's like, what really do games need to work on with storytelling? You know, what makes a really great storytelling in a game?
Well, I think it brings up an interesting point, which is that really, as gaming has continued to grow, it's gotten more and more kind of mainstream acceptance. There's more and more people who play games. It's different people play different kinds of games, but the number of people who just don't play video games at all has, at least from what I've seen, seems to be going down overall. Most people have at least some kind of game that they enjoy playing, even if it's simpler puzzle kind of games that people play. But as it grows its market, you end up with these kind of extremes that are kind of in some ways diverging, but in some ways kind of finding ways to commingle, which is at one end you have the big AAA titles with lots of money for production value, and
EA and Activision.
Yeah, like the big producer titles where they're going to be cranking it out, and they're going to put all kinds of funding behind it, and they're doing it not as a craft but as a product. They're making something that is sellable to a specific target audience, and they make games that are intended to, above all else, sell well. And in some ways that kind of hinders games in that genre, because it means that there are things that they are almost inherently not allowed to do. You can't tell stories as easily, or it's harder to justify in terms of money making, telling a story that may make the user who plays the game feel bad. You know, if you're in the middle of playing a game and you realize the game forces you to take a second to step back, look at what you've been doing, and say, hey, if you were actually doing this, it would make you a terrible person, and the only reason you've been doing it is because you've justified that, oh, it's just a game. Just a reminder, it doesn't necessarily make you a terrible person, but maybe, check yourself, because maybe you are a bad person.
Yourself.
Yeah, but, and I think that there's some really impactful things that you can do in games that are, similar to that really are almost off limits in terms of those, again, the big AAA titles where, selling lots and lots of units is the main goal. And at the other end, you kind of have indie games where it's companies who are, in some ways, they want to make a profit on it. Obviously, they want to, be able to pay their developers and everybody, and have, everybody be able to make a living at it, or at least as much as possible. And but really more important than the money in terms of those kind of production companies, and in general, and this is major generalization at either end, but it's more about the actual games themselves. It's about having games that are either present some kind of gameplay that this company wants to show off, or it has new storytelling elements to it that may make the player question things that they had previously thought, and or tell stories that make people feel uncomfortable, but make them at the same time maybe look more carefully at their own life. And so then at the same time, though, it's like, well, how many people can they reach necessarily if they're not making games for mass consumption? So you end up with these kind of dichotomy of different paradigms for how people who are making games are coming to the table with their own ideas for how they're going to go about it, and what kind of storytelling options are available to them. Because in my opinion, I would guess, without being privy to it necessarily, but I would guess that there's a lot of really great games that for one reason or another die on the cutting room floor. Either either the production company just can't handle parts of the game.
That's true of any industry.
Oh yeah, and I'm not saying that this is specific to games. I'm just saying gaming is finally getting to a point where it's really, I think, starting to hit some of these boundaries where at the low end, maybe the production companies don't have the funding to put together the kind of game or development that they need in order to tell the story that they're trying to tell. And at the other end, they may be afraid that telling the kind of story that that maybe somebody in the writing department or whatever is trying to tell is going to scare away potential long-term customers who they are trying to hold on to or bring in for the first time with these kind of titles.
Well, the one thing I'll say about that is one thing to remember is I do hold the original BioShock as an example of good storytelling in gaming and a good way to tell its story. And that's a 2K Games, 2K Studios game.
Yeah.
And they
Right.
are not indie.
they're
They
no-
are big. Like
Yeah.
a lot of people don't realize how much, like 2K has, they have the Borderlands franchise now. They've got a bunch of different sports lines. They've got the BioShock franchise. So it's like,
Right.
they're not a small industry. And I understand they're going to be outliers, of course. But it's a thing where we've seen AAA games can do it.
Oh yeah, and it can be done, but like I said, I'm concerned because as it grows, I guess is what my ultimate point is that as the industry grows, that we will see more and more games that are dismissed because they're indie or because they lack the kind of polish that AAA games get, or that just never make it at all because of money kind of oriented decision making, which isn't inherently bad. I mean, they're companies and they're paying all the people on the payroll and they have to make those decisions.
Even the indie developers have to make money if they want to keep making games.
Yeah,
'cause they have to
exactly.
keep
And there's
alive.
nothing wrong with looking at the bottom line as a major determiner of how you go with what you're doing. But
I feel like the big developers have been taking more and more of those chances as we get further and further away from
It's
the
weird
early
to see.
2000s.
yeah,
Because I feel like that's like it's kind of true, and I think the thing I've noticed is a lot is the developers are willing to take those chances, but not for very long. Like EA is already rebooting the Mirror's Edge franchise. They're already
that struck me
rebooting
as a
it.
weird decision.
The new Hitman got cut. They did have plans for Eidos to do another Hitman, and that got cut. And I've heard rumblings about Tomb Raider being like retooled again, even though it just got
Again.
rebooted. So it's like there are companies that are willing to take risks, but it doesn't look like they're willing to invest them like past like one game.
well, that's the thing is and that's
But,
some games really
to be honest,
only need one.
this is a
one
lot of
game to do it.
Business
But-
discussion, and I do want to get it back around to storytelling.
Right. Well, okay. So let's.
And Kyle, did you have? It seemed like you
Yeah.
had a little more you might have wanted to say about.
Not
Yeah.
about that particular point. I mean, I've got games I can bring up.
Well,
I think were
somebody
fine
bring up a
examples of-
game
I'd
they
be kind of
think
monopolizing things
does a
here.
good
You-
does a
if
good
you've got some
example of
stuff.
good storytelling.
Well, there's
Bring
some I feel that I really enjoyed and were great storytellings that cling to maybe more traditional film storytelling. The original Sands of Time comes to mind.
That was pretty good.
But that sticks to a very traditional narrative
Yeah.
frame flashback.
I'd say those were in that early example of games that started emulating kind of being able to tell a story like a movie does.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you had the early Square Enix games, of course. You had those early Final Fantasies. Mainly, it started with like Final Fantasy VII, where they had the like cutscenes, the big cutscenes.
Right.
But Prince of Persia was like one of the first, basically non-RPGs to really do it and do it well.
Yeah.
I will admit the story in the Sands of Time trilogy is really good, and I feel like the storytelling in those games is really solid too.
Well, and the first one stands out for me as being the best example of the three.
I would agree.
One of the best things about the way that ends up is that whole narrative. When you get to the very end, you sit down and you start telling this story of this adventure you just had, and the whole thing loops right back on.
Yeah.
itself.
Right, and it
comes back
kind of
around.
works with the
Excellent
time
way of
travel
doing it.
mechanic. Yeah.
You know, here you are getting all this narration through this entire story. It turns out you're the one telling it to somebody as you're playing it, kind of thing. So
Yeah, the character's narrating his own experience, so
Pretty
it
much, yeah.
kind of it helps you as the audience member to. There's a lot of times where they give you exposition of what he's thinking and his motivations and things like
Yeah.
that they don't have
Right.
to do awkwardly with him talking to somebody about it. Or
Yeah.
Okay, well, here that
That's-
brings up an interesting point, which is there are different methods for delivering a story. For how do you drive a story forward? And in my opinion, one of the most effective with relationship to video games is character-driven storytelling, where it's has more
It
to do
definitely
with
works well.
with characters as opposed to events necessarily. And the reason I say that is because in video games you really have the opportunity to take on the mantle of the characters in that
exactly
game.
what I was
And
going
so
to say.
instead of passively experiencing the kinds of events that happen around a character, where the character is kind of the main thread that connects all the events together, you really get to directly experience the all the kinds of crazy things that happen with them, and all the little nuanced things that that maybe you miss initially, but somebody may mention it in the story at some point, and you're like, oh yeah, I do remember that. Or there's lots of little subtle things that you can do to fiddle around with that. Once you have the player in the role of a character, or of it works, I think, best with a kind of smaller group of characters. But you can either kind of become that character or be directly interacting with that character for a long time, and I think that really serves as a strong mechanism by which you can kind of come up with ways to drive a story without it coming across as being too awkward. Either being like all exposition, or or just being action, unnarrated action where you're just kind of doing things and it doesn't really feel necessarily like it plays into any larger story. Having that control of a character really, I think, allows you to delve into the story itself.
Kind of lets you get absorbed.
Yeah, it lets you become a part of the story instead of just a passive observer of the story.
Yeah. And you have a game that you would like to demonstrate?
I was going to kind of say there were two: Call of Duty Modern Warfare and Modern Warfare 2.
I did play through
shooters, those were
the
pretty
first.
good.
For shooters,
I did play through the first one. I never played through the second one's campaign, but I did play through the first one.
It belonged to somebody else, and then he moved out. So,
Yeah.
But I was going to say
He who
I
shall
remember
not
in the
be named.
first one, he who shall not be named.
Green flame.
Green flame. Anyways.
Wow.
Anyways.
Okay.
So I was thinking, I remember in the first one of the things that I liked about the game is even though it had its kind of cutscene moments, there was never a non-first person setup. And I know that's more of a mechanic.
I will
of how the
admit that
story
is one
told.
thing about that the BioShocks share as well, is like every time there's some sort of cutscene, it's not like third person and you see everything that's happened. It's all done in-game engine from your point of view.
Yeah, and I like that as
Call
a
of Duty
story,
does the same thing.
and I like that as a storytelling element in the sense that you are still experiencing this as that character, which kind of goes into your character development.
It definitely works very well in first-person games.
Especially
it's a very,
first-person
very
games,
good way
yeah.
to do in first-person games.
Right.
But,
Well, and the thing
you
that
know-
they did in that game that helped, I think, is they let you jump between multiple characters.
They did.
Yeah,
You
so you could
had
still
soap, you had-
experience the story from different perspectives, but you still always felt like you were kind of the person experiencing it.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Yeah.
the thing that I remember as in the first game was a rather pivotal thing to me wasn't, a lot of people are like, well, there was the very end of the game when, there was kind of the cinematic moment where they throw you the gun and you have a couple seconds to shoot the bad guy.
Yeah.
But I think more back to the scene where the nuke explodes in the city.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
you're one of the guys who's trying to get out before it goes off, and it blows up and knocks you out of the helicopter, and you have to suffer through the guy's death
Yeah.
effectively in the game.
Yeah.
You're trying to get somewhere, but you still are going to die. And then, it's kind of one of those weird moments in the game where you're like, well, that was kind of depressing to play. But then you've got the second game when you go in and you shoot up an airport.
That was
And
pretty
that is
intense.
one of those, and I know I played it before. They released a patch or something later, where you could skip over it, or maybe it was there.
Yeah,
I
they
didn't
released
skip
a
it. I
patch that
played
they
it.
could eventually, it said you could skip this
And
mission.
it does get to one of those moments where you were saying earlier, where you're playing something in a game that makes you think, wow, if this was real, I'd be a terrible person for doing this.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I remember I did play through that far in the campaign.
Yeah.
Basically because our roommate Albert, he was like, you need to play through the campaign. And he's like, you'll know why.
Yeah.
And I got to that point, and yeah, it was just one of those moments where
I
you're
was
like,
aware of that level before I
Wow.
played it.
I had no idea.
Oh,
I
really?
went in blind. I had no idea it was coming up. Albert just told me to play it, meet for all the viewers. Yeah, he just told me to play it. And that was literally what he said. He said, "You need to play this, and you'll know why."
I'm sorry. Complete side note here. Because of this mic in the way, you're just reminding me
Yeah,
of
no.
Wilson from
I can only see the bottom of your face as well. It's okay.
I'm
Howdy ho,
totally
neighbor.
blocking these two with my mic in between.
It's hilarious.
Uh,
So anyway, it's things like that where not taking me out of that first person perspective and telling me the story as that character has always been something that's been very important to me in games, because especially when you cut from I accept cutscenes that are in games when they still at least stay in the game engine, but when they go from, because I used to have kind of a crappy gaming PC, and the cutscenes looked immensely better because they were pre-rendered on certain games.
The Square Enix cutscenes, where the game engine is your
Exactly.
characters are 9 polygons, but in the cutscene there are these beautifully rendered 3D models with like thousands of polygons, but everything's an animated JPEG.
Yeah. So, that's always been kind of, important to me, where it's like when I feel like I haven't really left the game and everything is still taking place as part of the game, that also helps to keep me in the story.
Yeah, I agree that definitely, especially in recent history, it's one of those things where you look at it and I go, you should have like no reason to not do a cutscene in the game engine.
Yeah.
I mean, game engines are good enough to put out visuals better than pre-rendered cutscenes did in the PlayStation 1 era.
Yeah.
So it's like, why would you ever take anything out of the game engine that, like, the really, like you talking about, like, it keeps you in...
Keeps you in the experience.
Keeps you experiencing the, it keeps you in the experience.
Well,
And
plus then
keeps
you're
you
not like
invested.
loading a full separate, like a full separate rendering engine where it's like, okay, now loading. Okay, here's the cutscene. Okay, now loading. We have to go back to loading the game engine again. Okay, now you can play again.
And I've
get that
experienced
jarring
that
disconnect.
difficulty of, there's a cutscene, and suddenly the screen would go black, and I'm like, well, what's going on? Oh, there's a cutscene. Okay, it doesn't cut immediately to it. But, one of the other things, too, in terms of the mechanics of playing, of how the story is told for me, is also telling the story as I'm playing it and not necessarily waiting for a cutscene to do something for me.
Well, that does go back and forth.
Yeah.
Because I'll bring up when we were playing Forced, and we were talking about how there was you can go watch the review. It will be up before this video for sure. When we were playing Force, we were talking about how there was the one boss fight where there was this exposition going on.
Yeah.
But we, like, not only kind of did we like choose not to pay attention, we couldn't.
It
Like,
was difficult to
there
pay
was
attention
so
and
much
play at the
shit
same
going
time.
on at
Right,
that same time that you have to kind of reach that that happy middle ground that is not always as achieved as Force clearly is a good example of. Is
really
sometimes
the big
when you try to
points-
tell the story during really, really intense stuff, the story is going to get completely missed.
Yeah. The big points of a story need to be told during lulls, effectively, when you're not really doing anything too important, or in a cutscene. So, as an example, spoilers on Arkham City. I think it's been long enough for that, too.
Arkham City, I think we can qualify as postmortem.
moratorium there. So there's a part in Arkham City where you're climbing Wonder Tower, and they start bombing the city right in front of you as you're climbing the tower. It's an interesting moment in the game where you finally find out what exactly it was these people were planning this whole time, and they just start bombing the city right in front of you as you're climbing the tower. And it's one of those things where it's being told as you're progressing through the game, but you're not doing anything so important that you can't go, oh, that's what's happening, and pay attention to it.
Yeah.
But then there's moments later in the game where, as you're falling off of the tower later with a couple characters, that's something that you wouldn't want to be interacting with at the time, because there is important part of a story being told there, and there's an important thing that happens at the very end that you don't want to miss. So they shouldn't have you doing something.
And mentioning Forced, that actually is going to kind of lead me into my second part of this, and I'm actually going to bring up a game that it's probably going to be very surprising, my thoughts on this for this game to all of you, because my choices. Because what I also want to bring up is kind of, in a game, I wonder if you guys agree, but in my opinion, a game is a game that marries its elements very well, where the storytelling and the gameplay mesh very well, and they form a cohesive sort of unit that doesn't get the story doesn't get in the way of the gameplay, and the gameplay doesn't get in the way of the story.
Yeah.
And one game I actually think has good storytelling and I actually very much applaud, is Mass Effect 2. The Mass Effect franchise, I have my issues with it that are completely unrelated to storytelling that I'm not going to bring up at this moment. But as far as storytelling in the game is concerned, I think that is a really good example of what modern games can do with telling a story, because of all of the ways you can make it your specific story. Like the ways that like me and Ben, like the four of us could play through it and get no wholly repeated stories if we wanted to. Like we might get very similar stories mainly because we're friends, so we clearly have slightly similar personalities. So there may be some
Albert
choices.
Because he'll just around the whole time, and you'll get a totally different story because he's not taking any of it seriously.
Wow, I didn't even know you could do that in this game.
Yeah, Albert will find the way to stop the Reaper Horde in the second game.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he will. Or he'll find a way to kill Anderson, like in the first game. Like kill him, not like not choose him for the Senate, like actually kill him somehow. But
I'll pull out my guns.
I'll pull out my gun. But yeah, I think that those games actually did a really good job with actual interactive storytelling, which I think is the thing that, like, to me, that's the holy grail of video game storytelling. That is what video games want to be. They want you to have a story that you can kind of create on your own.
Not just telling a story, but your version of that story.
And especially the one thing I really liked about the reason why I picked Mass Effect 2 is the ending to Mass Effect 2 is one of the most impressive examples of storytelling in a game I can give, because the gameplay and the storytelling marriage very well to where you can play through the game and finish the game, but also at the same time kind of lose. Like you can lose every member of your party, even Shepard. Like Shepard can die. And there's a legitimate way and it's not a game over screen. It's not like, oh, you ran out of lives, game over, the game's done, you have to restart from the last checkpoint. Like, no, it's a narrative ending. You finished it, and yeah, Kyle said it perfectly. It's a real narrative ending, an official canon ending to the game where Shepard dies and everybody on his team dies. And the way they pulled it off was actually, in my opinion, extremely impressive. All my other qualms with the games exist still, but as far as interactive storytelling goes, I feel like they also did a good job of, in the Mass Effect games, not really letting the gameplay get in the way of the story. Because like I said, as I mentioned with Force, I feel like at that scene at the boss battle, I feel like the exposition and the gameplay are at odds. Yeah. Like you have to pay attention to one or the other, and you're not going to get through the exposition if you don't pay attention to the gameplay, because you're going to die and you're not going to finish the level, and you might as well just start over. And yeah, you have to pay, and especially in Force is a very skill heavy game, so like you have to pay attention very heavily, especially as we noticed in the later stages, that you cannot pay attention to random exposition happening between your little spirit dude and the boss. Like, you have to make sure he's not killing you. So I feel like that's a problem in Forced, and I feel like that's a problem for me in BioShock Infinite. I felt like the narrative and the gameplay never married together. Like, they never meshed together. And the big thing that killed it for me is nothing in the gameplay can affect Elizabeth. Absolutely nothing. Nothing in what you actually perform in the game affects Elizabeth. She can't die in a firefight. None of the choices you actually make in the game, they don't mean anything for the story, period, but they also don't mean anything for Elizabeth. And I feel, like I said, with the original, with Mass Effect, I feel like that's the peak that video games want to be at is to have interactive stories.
Well, here the thing is, I feel like BioWare is kind of at the forefront of at least attempting to tell stories in such a way that they're genuinely interactive, so that the kinds of choices that they offer you, when they offer you choices, the choices that they offer you have some impact on the game. Now, the degree to which that impact
It's variable.
is real, is realized later on is, varies widely depending on the game and the choice. Some games obviously have more impactful choices than others.
I feel like they've done a good job, but I mean, you, like I know that you particularly have, Devin and Tymo, I'm not so sure, but the old, some of the old SNES era RPGs, or even the early 90s era PC games that were like based on like the Baldur's Gates and stuff like that.
Right.
I feel like they did it a little bit, and admittedly, BioWare with the Mass Effect series kind of went like full bore with it as much as they could.
It was a major
anyways.
goal for those games in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, but I would say that while they're good at it, I wouldn't necessarily place them as the forefront of that. I mean, Square Enix had a couple of games that did it back on the Super Nintendo.
I'm not saying that they're the pioneers of that concept, because like you said, it goes all the way back to the kind of choose your own adventures, or like the old multi-user dungeons that predate modern MMOs. They all kind of had that very story driven kind of mentality as part of the gameplay, where a big part of the game is itself creating the story that you are specifically telling. And I think though that in terms of as consistently as any company has, making that kind of a priority in terms of the gameplay itself, I think BioWare is more commonly including that kind of thought process of, when writing the story, actually write several stories and provide opportunities to pick what story you are telling as a user in terms of actions that you take, instead of only in terms of to varying degrees, because again, some games are definitely guilty of it, but just junctures where there's like, here's a choice, pick A or B.
Yeah.
I
think the choice is kind of one of those things where the impact is immediate.
Right.
Pick A or B, and it's literally a fork in the road.
Yeah.
Whereas with Mass Effect, sometimes the impact isn't realized until later in the game.
The next game, kind of, sometimes. Yeah, I was going to say, I would definitely agree. BioWare kind of started it a long time ago when they did the first Knights of the Old Republic. There was...
And even then, BioWare was, before Knights of the Old Republic, BioWare was... the old Baldur's Gates, so they've been legitimately, they have been at it for a long time
of working that kind of stuff into story and gameplay. And with KOTOR, you had you had the two endings of whether you were light or dark, but you also had multiple branches within the story. They didn't really majorly affect the outcome, except for changing what side of the force you were on.
You bring up Knights of the Old Republic, and it reminds me of the old Jedi Knight games. Where you actually could have the light ending or the dark ending, depending on what you did through the game.
Well, that was always a fun part of the Star Wars games, is you could always pretty much do that.
They threw that in, especially any game that has to deal with Jedis. A lot of the Star Wars games.
Yeah, that's the easy choice.
Yeah.
You were talking about how you don't feel the narrative and the gameplay in Infinite ever mesh in this level that we want. Well, let me bring up another game that does kind of the same thing with its companion that everybody's given accolades to the storytelling.
Last of Us
would be The Last of Us.
I personally have not played that.
That's okay.
Well, I feel the argument
it sounds like it has that is another game I have been noticing has been on a lot of people's Game of the Year lists, and it's for a lot of the same reasons. It sounds like that BioShock Infinite is on a lot of people's games.
You know what? I will say I have not played it either, and I feel a little bit sad about it, because it seems like from the pieces of the story that I've heard, because I've kind of intentionally avoided outright spoilers just because I feel like eventually I may play it.
There's zombies.
But oh shit. No, but just from the kind of pieces of the story that I've got from it, I feel like it seems really intriguing. But at the same time, I don't own a PlayStation 3, and I would feel dumb, even with PlayStation 4 being out. I would feel dumb just buying it for a game, like for one game.
So go get yourself a PS Vita and use PlayStation Now. Done.
Maybe.
Anyways,
it's a very character driven narrative, and that's something we talked about earlier. if you listen to the developers talk about why they made the choices they did with your companion not triggering any of the enemy alerts.
Yeah.
Essentially, she's invulnerable when you're not controlling her, because there are segments of the game where you control Ellie, and at that point she functions like the normal player character does.
Mm-hmm.
But when they talk about it, they talk about every time they play tested it where the game reacted to her like a normal player character.
Yeah.
It became so frustrating for the player experience that nobody wanted to touch it. And that sounds like gameplay getting in the way of storytelling to me.
That is true, but
true.
that also comes around to, at that point, do you have to either rethink your story or rethink your gameplay?
Well, I think
they did. I think they rethought their gameplay.
I think
They
part
did,
of it is,
and I'm not saying it's a terrible choice. It's one of those things where, you know, there's the history of the escort missions. They're notoriously something
likes
that
that
people hate,
Yeah.
mainly because the character AI of whoever you're supposed to be traveling with is usually atrocious, and that really came from, you know, the computers have to treat your companion kind of like another player, like Kyle was mentioning.
Yeah.
But it's not another.
But they're not
player.
as robust as
computer.
in terms of their abilities as another player. But what I was going to say is, I think that a big part of, at least in terms of story, why you could maybe justify that too is that there's the dynamic between the characters is different. There's like a father figure kind of role, it seems like, from what I've seen, that you're representing there, and so it's kind of it ties into other psychological elements besides just kind of like a generic companionship kind of thing, which is
it's there with it's there in
BioShock Infinite.
in BioShock a little bit. It's not as clearly overt as it is in The Last of Us, it seems, because
the
Ellie
themes are
is
certainly more
significantly-
well developed in The Last of Us.
Ellie is significantly younger than Elizabeth.
Right,
Elizabeth
right.
is not this 13-year-old girl accompanying you. She is a
Yeah.
woman. So it's there a little bit in that, you know, whenever you have that male protector of a female, there's, you know, in a lot of cases, there's always some click in the back for men. There's going to be some click in the back of your mind of some sort of paternal protection coming off. But in The Last of Us, like, you legitimately could be the age to be Ellie's dad, whether you are or not. Like, the character, I don't know, are you actually... You're not Ellie's father, right?
No. Joel starts out the game. It starts out like right when the infection hits the U.S. and he's maybe 30.
Yeah.
It jumps ahead 20 years, and she's supposed to be right around 13, 14. So Joel's almost 50, 55.
So yeah, like, he's almost like old enough to be a grandfather at
Yes.
that point.
Well, and one of the other key things at the very beginning of the game, you have a daughter. At the very beginning of The Last of Us, you have a daughter.
And she gets, I'm assuming,
She dies.
goes by the wayside.
Yeah.
When
She
the
doesn't
zombie
meet a
attack
pleasant
happens.
end.
Does not meet a pleasant end.
And it is a sad moment. I cried.
But that's what I'm saying though, and not to try and, you know, poke fun or anything, but that's a story element where there's
That is even a storytelling
then,
element,
right?
Like
well, because
the act of instilling fatherly instincts,
right? Because that's
or a
not something that they have to do.
parental instincts, I should say,
yeah.
in a player is a good way to get them invested in the
and that's kind of where I'm going, because they don't have to write him as having a daughter, but they do, because it allows you to then project that onto
The rest of the game.
yeah, exactly. You carry that with you into the rest of the game, and it makes you more invested as a player in the characters in the game. And it doesn't take a whole lot of extra effort to do that, but it without standing in the way of the game itself is a way to really draw people more into the game. And I think that that's not really the same kind of case as with like BioShock Infinite, where it seems like in BioShock Infinite, Elizabeth kind of plays more of a role where she kind of is like a just generic support that's just kind of there. And I feel like having a constant companion is something that is hard to justify in certain ways, you know, because it can be really, really annoying if there's not a real mind behind it, because, you know, AI is only so good, and if it's, you know, if it ends up being, you know, 10 enemies versus one friendly, that, you know, a lot of times ends badly for friendly AI unless they intentionally script it in such a way where the enemy AI is considerably dumber than the than your friendly AI,
Yeah.
and then you have other gameplay issues that come out just because of that, and it becomes an issue of,
Well,
do
in some
you want to
ways,
fine tune that forever, or do you want to find other ways of making the gameplay not intrusive, but at the same time, still usable? And
well,
at that point, though, there kind of comes this trade-off. It's like, well, okay, but if you have a character who's constantly there, but you're not, I don't know. I didn't play that much of Infinite, honestly. I played just very small sections of it, but I never really felt emotionally connected to the characters that deeply. It seemed like Elizabeth was just kind of there, and I didn't really ever feel like, oh God, she's running off on her own and is gonna get killed, or oh man, she totally saved my ass tossing me some.
Well, and kicking it back
not the former, but the latter, definitely. There were definitely moments in Infinite where I'm out of ammo, I'm huddled in the back corner of a room, I had nothing left, and I hear Booker catch, and she throws me another clip, and I'm like, yes, now I have what I need to get out of this situation.
Right.
And in Last of Us, it was more like the fatherly protection thing. I don't want her near the combat because I don't want her to get stabbed in the throat or eaten by the clicker. I just want her to stay over in this corner and maybe shank a guy when he's about to stab me in the throat.
Yeah. That's something I was going to say is a lot of times when you were in The Last of Us, when I was playing through it, during any firefight, you could look over at Ellie and see that she's huddled behind something, just protecting herself, because that's what you want her to do. And most of the time when something would happen, he would say, shh, stay down, or something like that to her, and tell her, he would be that protective figure. When I would get into a firefight in BioShock, I have no idea where
Elizabeth
Who
just kind
knows
of
what the shit
vanishes
Elizabeth is doing?
All I
until
know
she has something
is
to
if
throw
I
you.
look-
I mean, I think she's still there, like in the game space, but she's off somewhere that like you don't even.
Yeah,
I think they pull that Sherlock Holmes Watson
shiny.
trick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, it is.
It's definitely that moment
it's a
I
pocket
can't
Deus
look
Ex
around.
Machina. Like we're reserving the right to save your ass at any moment.
Yeah,
She does have the ability to pull open doors to other realities.
Well, actually,
But that's what I was gonna say.
that actually directs me to one of the things that, again, it's something I feel like the gameplay gets. Devin,
I was trying to
go on.
finish. That's exactly what
Okay.
I was going with.
Okay.
That is, I can't look around like I can in The Last of Us and see where Elizabeth is. I have no idea where she is until I tell her to open a tear or I need ammo, and she throws it to me, and then she just appears.
Yeah.
I don't know where she is, so I do feel like
Hammerspace.
in that game she acts as a support character when you're in a firefight. Outside of that, she's a plot point, but
Well, and to get back to the gameplay and the story not meshing, it's one of those things where in the game during like the cutscenes, it's clear that her dimensional opening stuff is not necessarily something that doesn't take a toll on her.
Yeah.
Like there's a point in the story where you kind of figure out that it's not necessarily an unlimited resource that she just can do however the hell she wants. And it clearly takes her a little effort to make big ones. And in the gameplay, when you get to the
opening all those tears.
well, yeah, that's the thing is when you get into a firefight, you're just like open the tear. I mean, you don't even have like doesn't even have like a cooldown or anything. It just when you're in a firefight, it can happen whenever the hell you want.
Yeah.
But when it's good for the story, it's limited. It takes a toll. It takes some time, and that's the kind of thing I was talking about, where the narrative and the gameplay don't really meet up.
That's true.
They are two completely separate entities, and when you're in a firefight, you're in the game, and then when you're in the cutscenes, you're in the story, and they don't really, for me, they never met up.
And like I said, I didn't play that much of it. It didn't seem like it was super bad, but I totally understand kind of the point of what you're getting at. To me, it felt like I kind of see what you mean, where there's cutscene version of what's happening and gameplay version of what's happening, but I don't know. I never really felt like
which is not necessarily a problem that's specific to BioShock Infinite, especially in a lot of
we're
older,
not just picking on that.
especially in a lot of older era RPGs.
Yeah,
there were a lot of those
absolutely.
RPGs where it's like your character could die in a fight 15 million times, but hey, I got a Phoenix down, so you're okay. But then when it's crucial to
Right,
the
and there's a
story, the
plot
character
point.
actually dies.
Yeah.
Which actually brings me around to another game that I think best shows off marriage of gameplay and story that actually a lot of people might not think about, which is actually the Fire Emblem series.
Haven't ever played any of those.
In the
Only
Fire
played a
Emblem
couple of
series, the Fire Emblem series, the main thing that sets it apart a lot from other like strategy RPG series, it's a very standard Japanese style strategy RPG, much like Final Fantasy Tactics. And the thing that sets it apart mostly from a lot of other games in the line, like Shining Force, Final Fantasy Tactics, and things like that, is permanent character death. When a character dies in a fight, they die in the game.
They're out of the story.
They are officially gone. And it's not like you have a bunch of nameless thugs A through C in your party, and it's like, oh, they're just these generic people. Especially in the newer games, they all have backstories, they all have names, they all have character to them. It's it might not necessarily, they might not all have the most amazing of character and backstories to them, but they have it. It is there.
Right.
And so when they die, you are losing a person. You're not losing a nameless thing. And when they die, they're dead. Not when it's story convenient, it's when it happens. Now, there's a lot of instances where, like, if a character that is story important dies, you kind of lose that fight and you have to play it over again. But the non kind of main story important characters, they can die at any time. And that's one of those things where it's like that, without realizing, I don't think a lot of people see, is that that can be a thing to kind of create your own story for what happened in your playthrough of Fire Emblem. Like, you might have lost this one guy really early on and then played the whole game without him, whereas your friend kept him and lost somebody else in the last, 3/4 of the game that you completed the game with. It's just one of those things of the consistency between, I think the best thing when it comes to marrying story and gameplay is clearly for me, is the consistency between the gameplay and the story. Like, if something happens in the story one way, it should happen in the gameplay the same way. Like in Fire Emblem, death is death. There's no difference.
You know what I kind of wonder, though, now that you're talking about it, just kind of with relation to what you were specifically saying about BioShock Infinite, is it makes me wonder if at some point in development, maybe they did have like a cooldown on doing the tears and stuff, and it just got to the point where there were fights where it was like you just can't get through it without being able to do more than that, and it was just removed as an element, maybe.
Well,
it's possible.
Her powers, if you look at I just watched a YouTube video on it the other day where they took all the, like, from the announcement trailer and the 2010 E3 footage and the 2013, there's drastic changes to the way Elizabeth's powers function from each video.
There's drastic changes to almost everything from video to video to video.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
the
first gameplay,
I remember the handyman was bald in the first one. He wasn't the generic, like, posh British governor handyman that he is in Infinite. Or no, it's the other way around. He's bald in the actual game. All the handymans are like oafish thugs. Yeah. And in the original trailer, like, it was like a big dad. Like, he seemed like intelligent. He looked like just a kind of a regular person, just with this huge like robotic body.
Well, I think
it was very different.
I think that's what Songbird became.
Yeah,
I feel like
in the initial trailer, it really seemed like kind of handymen were going to be like the big enemy, and then I think it was around like the second trailer that came out, which was like the next year at the next E3. That's when like Songbird kind of
popped up.
I don't know if it was the plan all along or if it was something that came up across that year, but then Songbird came in as like, okay, this might seem like the actual big enemy of the game. But no, yeah, a lot of that game definitely, if you go back through and look at the history of its trailers, the game changed quite a few times, and I'm sure that the gameplay was part of that. Yeah,
well, and the way her powers function, at least in the videos, look a lot more like they tax her than they do in the final game. Yeah, in the final game, there, every once in a while, she does something that visibly affects her, but it doesn't seem like, to me anyway, every time she opens a tear, it takes a toll. And as the story progresses, it seems like it gets easier and easier and easier and easier for her to do it.
But that's one of those things is, so should it have been Like, should it have been on a cooldown earlier in the game when she
Yeah,
was
and you can,
clearly
like, unlock
not
a
as
skill that-
in control of it?
that
And then
gets
at
rid
the
of
end
that
of
or
the
something.
game, is she just like, bam, tear, bam, tear, bam, tear, you know?
That probably would have given it that extra
That extra oomph
je
it
ne
might
sais
have
quoi, I
needed.
guess.
Je ne sais quoi.
Well, as just an example, you know, it's like when earlier on in the game when you are going through tears that she's opening, it's very clear you're walking through a tear. But if you think at the point where future Elizabeth pulls you forward, you have no idea you've gone forward. in
Spoilers,
time.
by the way. I was trying to avoid that one.
It's not a huge spoiler. It's not.
But
there's
let's
a
try and
moment-
avoid it as much as possible.
Because
There's a
Devin
moment.
says it's not.
Yeah.
There's a moment when you get pulled forward in time.
Yeah, but Devin's a racist.
Spoiler. Devin's a terrible human
Yeah.
being and shouldn't
Screw
be taken
you all
seriously
non-Bioshock
under,
players.
under any circumstances.
But with
Anyways.
the tears, where it's-
Rosebud's the sled.
Bruce Willis was dead the whole time. Anyway, where you don't notice that something has happened until you see that something has happened.
I would
That's
argue.
a totally stupid sentence.
That was
I
that
would-
was not your best sentence.
Without trying not
I get
to,
what you're trying to say.
trying not
it's
to
less
show major
obvious.
spoilers.
Eventually, it's less obvious that reality has changed to Booker.
Yeah.
I mean, whether or not it's obvious to the player is it's from person to person.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, that
Like, some people might have
more in
guessed
the
that Bruce
sense
Willis
of-
was dead before the end of Sixth Sense.
Yeah,
Some
but I
people
mean-
didn't even know even after the end of Sixth Sense.
Yeah.
And no, we can spoil Sixth Sense. That is so post-mortem, it's not even funny.
But my point being that with Elizabeth's powers, you know, her in the far future is so good at at pulling these tears and doing these and using her powers that she can do them without you noticing that they've happened at all.
But
Well, my
here's
point that
hold
I'm
on,
going for.
hold on.
but that doesn't work with their story at that moment.
Spoilers for anybody that still doesn't want anything else spoiled. When you finally run into her in the future, she says she used the last of her power to bring you to her. She says that line specifically verbatim.
No, I
Yes.
know. I'm
Which
just saying.
also is weird because then you're like, well, if you use the last of your power to bring me here, how the hell do you plan on getting me back? Is Doc Brown around with a DeLorean somewhere?
Well,
You were supposed to bring magic pots.
No,
with you.
no, you're gonna
I
go
feel like
find
supposed
the
to
that's
bring the flux
doctor.
capacitor.
Yeah.
I feel like that's an error made by the character, not an error made by the developer.
Yeah, I mean, it is clearly something that she might not have been fully aware, but it's a thing where she knows that her power is dwindling, which means her power is not infinite, as the title may describe, or at least in that future.
I don't
her
think
power is
infinite
not
There are
infinite.
describing
circumstances that.
But
alter
that means that most likely at the beginning of the game, her powers were not also infinite as
No,
well.
there's a point
And
where she achieves that.
I feel like that's the thing I'm like we have discussed, where
To me, that's the line between perfect game and good game.
yeah, that's true.
And
I'm not
everything
saying
strives
that,
for perfection, but
I'm not saying that BioShock Infinite necessarily has very bad storytelling.
But it's
From
got big
a
shoes
story,
to fill, though, because of the name.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a thing too. But also, I would say while we're on this topic right now, while I agree that the first half of the original BioShock has great storytelling, I feel like they also fell short in the second half because the second half doesn't really play much differently than the first half. It's a lot like the BioShock Infinite thing. The second half, you don't get to make any more choices in the second half than you did in the first half. And in the first half, you knew people were basically brainwashing you to do whatever they wanted. Now that you're your own man, you essentially go about things the exact same way. And I feel like that is another moment where, for the first half of the original BioShock, I feel is really good. I feel like the second half misses some potential. It was still good. It was still decent, but it was, you know, the prime example of good storytelling in the first BioShock is all the way up till when you meet Andrew Ryan. And that reveal, and then after that, it's okay. It doesn't get bad. It's still well written. It's still, scenes are still framed very well, things like that. But I feel like it had a potential at that point to start doing something else with its storytelling, because you just had this big reveal which kind of shatters your world. And I feel like they had a potential to start doing the storytelling a little bit differently in the second half and didn't.
Yes, I would agree. The Andrew Ryan reveal in the original BioShock is the climax of that game.
Oh, yeah.
And it kind of limps out.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I kind of felt that was one thing that I felt like was kind of weird in that it feels like that happens really early in the game, because it really did to me feel like
It's about a
climax of
halfway.
the game.
It's about a
it's
halfway
half
point.
to 2/3.
But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is in my mind that really is.
But
kind
it
of
is-
like
it
the main
is-
climax of the,
It
of
is
the
the
story.
Luke,
that
I
they're
am
telling.
your father of
Yeah, but-
BioShock
but
1,
because
and it
there's
happens
still a whole half of the
comparatively
game left to do at that
early.
point. It feels almost anticlimactic to have a lot of the kinds of stuff that happens after still going on.
Yeah, and it sounds like they probably conceived of the story with this moment and worked backwards, and then we're like, well,
Yeah.
we got to wrap this up.
Yeah. And they're like, well, okay, let's wrap it up like this.
And they kind of, yeah, it was a chance, like you said, it was a chance for them to get, if they had done something completely different in the second half of the storytelling, it, again, could have been so much better. But
Well, like a good
it's hard
example-
to judge things against what might have been.
Well, like a good example is one Ben will know, because we both are huge fans of the game and have both read an article that very well lines it out, is the way Chrono Trigger handles its story is there's a portion, the first about 2/3 of the game are actually relatively linear. Like you're going back and forth between timelines, and it has that generic SNES era RPG openness where, you know, the maps are a little open and, you know, you can wander around the overworld and then go to towns and stuff. But as far as like key plot points, it's still relatively linear. You're moving from point to point to point to advance the plot. But then something happens about 2/3 of the way through the game. No, I love the game too much to spoil it for anybody. But then at that point, the story actually really opens up. Like there's a lot of extra story elements you can go do
Or not do.
and it
And
is a legitimate, like, it actually has an impact on the story, much like the
on
Mass
the
Effect
characters
choices
and on,
do.
Yeah.
So I feel like when it comes to the first BioShock, I feel like almost BioShock should have been like that, where like the first 2/3 of the game up until the Andrew Ryan reveal should have been very, very confining for the purposes of that big reveal. And then after that, that's when you can open things up, much like Chrono Trigger did. And that's kind of where they just went.
Yeah, well, and at that point you can have the gameplay
a lot
be
like
very
Kyle
similar.
talked about.
And
It
you know
seems
what?
like
Instead of being like
they
the middle
started
of the
with
game,
that reveal.
you could at that point have had something where it's like, okay, there's all these things that I can do, but you know what? I'm just gonna wrap it up. I'm just gonna go. I don't want to do any of these other things.
I want to call him Comstock, but that's not the guy. The like
Atlas?
mobster guy, Atlas.
Yeah.
It's like I just want to go
Well,
grease
that's
Atlas.
his later name.
Fontaine.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember the
No, Vic
mobster guy's
Fontaine's from
name.
Deep Space Nine.
You get out right now.
No, but you know what I mean though. Like I feel like that would have been a really strong choice, because then you could have this climax, and it's like at that point you can either choose to continue.
Well, at
playing
that
the game and
point,
try
the
and
end
do
of the
lots
game
other things.
can be closer to the climax.
Yeah, I was gonna say, or if you want, you can try and just kind of continue the game in such a way that you just kind of finish it, and at that point, like you said, you collapse down all that extra stuff where it's like, if it's clearly optional, then I feel like that at that point, although it may make the story much longer, it doesn't necessarily feel like it, because in terms of the story arc, it's that it's side stuff. It's not part of like the main story. But if you make it more or less all, required in order to continue, then it really does kind of squish it all down so that the climax of the story happens like halfway through the game.
I do remember that in BioShock, what was the lady doctor?
Tenenbaum?
Yeah, Dr. Tenenbaum.
Yeah, Tenenbaum.
One
That
of
was
the
in charge
points
of the
is
Little
after
Sisters.
Yeah.
after the reveal, she asks you to help her stop Fontaine.
Yeah.
And then she'll help you get out. That becomes your driving force after that.
Well,
But I
at
think
that
it would have
point,
been
you're just
interesting if
changing-
there were multiple ways to go about that.
Yeah,
like if
there
there
are
were
multiple
things you
ways
could
to
do
go about it, or
to
just
go
say,
around
"Screw you,
BioShock.
I'll find my own way
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, or that, or if you could just like, F you, bitch, I'm gonna try and find my own way out.
Well,
It would have been nicer if you are correct that, you know, if after the fact, if I had my own choices at that point.
again, hindsight 2020, but
Yes.
here's
So, yeah.
here's an interesting thought. If they end the first BioShock seconds after the reveal and Rapture's falling apart and Fontaine's in charge, and you just credits, and then you put out a complete
That could've been
BioShock
interesting.
2
That could have been very interesting.
is the fallout from that and what happens.
I think that could have been very interesting. That could have
And
been very interesting because I mean, it's
could be a
it's
completely
the
different
Empire
type of
Strikes
game.
Back
Yeah.
of BioShock at that point. You get
Yeah.
this huge reveal, and shit's still all f***ed up,
Right.
and then you're like, okay, what happens next?
From a
Find out
narrative
next time.
standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, but I
Yeah.
can understand why maybe circling
I can
back around to the
understand-
beginning, a
Well,
big
we
company's
had
not
that-
going to want to do that.
You know, we had
Right.
that talk about how AAA companies maybe like to take risks, but not for more than one game. So maybe they were like, okay, it might be nice to cut the story off here, but we can't guarantee we're going to get another game. But we do want to, you know,
Yeah,
wrap
some
this
more
guy's.
gameplay,
We
wrap
want
it
to
up.
do wrap up the story of the clone of Andrew Ryan. So let's finish it off. Let's get him out of BioShock.
Which is funny because in
Out of
contrast,
Rapture.
Hollywood does that crap all the time.
Well,
Or
that's
they-
because
they,
that's
like-
because that's because Hollywood is an older industry.
Yeah, but it's
well,
it's,
but
it's just funny
would
to
you
look at.
expect a major studio film to end with the main character defeated, broken, and in a dying environment? That's never going to happen unless it's in an Empire situation.
There are
where
some
it's an
we know
established
specific instances,
franchise,
but yeah,
there's
it's
more
usually something
coming.
that's like you said, like an Empire franchise where an Empire situation where that was the middle of a trilogy.
You know what?
knew-
You know what I miss?
it's
is-
like the end of Enter the Matrix. No, oh God, I'm trying to remember the name. There's Matrix Revolutions, the second one.
Yeah,
It's like that.
Reloaded.
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 Yeah.
Reloaded. It's
they
like
only
that.
made the one Matrix movie, so
It's
I
very
understand your
similar to
confusion.
that sort of ending, but again, Matrix Reloaded. Matrix Reloaded was part 2 of 3, and they actually,
Yeah.
you know, it's even like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They filmed them both at the same time, so
Yeah.
like they knew they were going to get a second movie, well, a third movie at that point, but they knew they were going to get a follow up, so
Yeah.
they could leave with that cliffhanger.
It is just interesting to see that you know, it's like even though Hollywood does it all the time, and they spend so much more on films than we do on games.
But films
So far.
generally have a higher profit margin.
Of course.
Well, but, okay, here's something though that's kind of related to that. I feel like there's this whole opportunity that's being missed in that you know, games have this opportunity to tell a story that just ends on like a dark note like that. You know, like sometimes, you know, the protagonist does everything right and they totally, you know, quote unquote win. They achieve all their objectives and the world is still gone to shit. Like, you know, there's still all these things that are totally outside their control. They still end up dying. Like, you know, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to tell stories.
You mean like the ending I was talking about to Mass Effect 2 earlier, kind of like that.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Where-
but I'm
the-
saying not in the context of a larger story where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
it's like, you know, oh, it's all bad, but you know, we all kind of in the back of our head know it's because they're working on another one, but like just to tell a story where it's like, you know, where it's
Well, if you
it's
think
kind of
about
like
it,
there's
really
not
that-
as many games that kind of do that where at the end it's like,
there aren't as many, but you know, it's a great example, and people might take issue with us labeling it as a game. Heavy Rain.
Yeah.
Actually, that was something I thought about bringing up. Is 2 good examples I think of a really good interactive storytelling are Heavy Rain and the Stanley Parable. But while I think they're great examples of interactive storytelling, I'm hesitant to label them as games, and I have reasons for that we can discuss in another podcast if we want to.
I would agree when you say that. Stanley Parable is an amusing thing more than anything, but you know, I played through all of
It's an
Heavy Rain.
amazing, hilarious piece of interactive storytelling.
Yeah,
but
I played through
as
Heavy
far
Rain.
as a video game, that's debatable.
Correction, I
And I don't
interacted
think
with
it
Heavy
is.
Rain.
I don't think Stanley Parable technically
Heavy
qualifies
Rain
as a
is
game
much
to me.
more an interactive story
Yeah.
than it is a video
Oh,
game.
yeah.
To me, it's always been like the modern successor to point and clicks.
The Heavy Rain is very much like that.
yeah, I could see that.
And yeah, in Heavy Rain, there's a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of the story that can just get cut out because in Heavy Rain, there
Characters
are
can die.
Yeah,
There's that
characters
permanent
can
death
die. It's
element.
much like the Fire Emblem games. Characters can die, and you cannot get a game over screen. You can keep going in the
Right.
story narratively.
You can
but
continue
the
to live in
characters
the
still
doomed
die.
world you've created.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. To quote Morrowind. To quote Morrowind. Well, and that's another just a quick side note that I thought of because the Elder Scrolls games are fairly good about having really open stories that you can kind of go through at your own pace and kind of creating your own experience with those. But one thing I feel like they did really well with Skyrim when it comes to relating the marriage of gameplay and narrative is the world doesn't freeze when you talk to people anymore. Because that was always a big thing about Oblivion is everything stops when you initiate conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's like it's
So you're
really
not-
this
you're not
really
gonna get
good moment
attacked or
for you
whatever.
to get through some story. But it's, yeah, like I could be in the middle of the last boss fight and just talk to some dude and just leave the game running and
just
it will
hit
never
pause.
happen.
Yeah.
It hits pause like that program you showed us
Yeah.
earlier. Okay, so I think we'll bring this a little bit to a close. I think we're at a little over an hour worth of podcast here now. So let's I'll go around and we'll get some final thoughts by everybody. We'll start with Tymo.
I still enjoy storytelling devices that cling to more traditional, maybe film tropes, I guess. Interactive
Yeah.
experiences are great and they can really pull you in and it's easy to get immersed in those.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's still possible to tell a film-like story
That's very
in an
true.
interactive medium.
that
and
is
have
very
it be
true.
good.
That is very true. Devin?
I'd say above all else, if the story is good, even if the storytelling isn't the best way of doing it, the way the mechanics work, the way they mesh, if the story is good, the story's good. That's really what it comes down to for me. There are games that I will probably never replay that had a great story, but it's because I've already heard the story one time.
Yeah, it's
So.
some of those games that have that one playthrough.
Yeah.
While
I'll
really
probably
good,
never
it's not
play Infinite
necessarily-
again.
Yeah,
DLC, yeah, but
but you're talking to the base game,
yeah.
the campaign. Benjamin Arthur?
I've always been of the opinion that the games are a really novel and unique way of presenting a story. They allow you to do things that you might not otherwise have been able to do. Like, for example, there's the sci-fi genre, for example, is allowed to examine kind of social and other kind of aspects of our lives from a unique perspective where you can kind of step back and look at it. I think games do something very similar where you can present a story, you can present a point of view or a concept that ties very strongly to things that are actually going on in people's real everyday lives, or maybe even just going on in the world around you, but maybe it's not something that you're directly affected by, and give you a chance to tell stories that allow you to kind of look again at the things that are going on in the world and in life from a different perspective, and maybe learn something not only about yourself, but just about the world around you also, and maybe why people do the kinds of things that they do by experiencing something that's similar maybe to what somebody else has experienced.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's clear by now, I'm a huge fan of any game that actually can produce a very nice interactive story. And for me, the main thing is marrying the story to the gameplay, because I feel like games are getting to that point where, the disconnect, I want to say, kind of is no longer acceptable. Not that it's like, oh my god, if you have this disconnect, it's atrocious, like it's an atrocity if it does happen, but it can be done, and I feel like they're really, really good games that have the best stories are the ones that actually can marriage them together with the gameplay, because that's part of what makes it a really great game. And that's what makes it, for me, a really great story in the game, is as much marriage to the actual gameplay as possible. Because like we were saying earlier, that helps you kind of draw yourself into the story, in my opinion. So, thank you for all of you who listen to this podcast. We always appreciate anybody that is actually willing to sit through these things.
Because I'm not.
So, hopefully that's something that helped you in some way. Maybe you learned something. Maybe you heard about a game that you might want to try out sometime soon. But for now, we're going to sign off. I am Nasty Man.
Benjamin Arthur.
Tymo.
Scary Uncle Devin.
Thank you for listening to Press A to Climb Soapbox.